and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to a new topic today. So before we actually get to the text, let's talk a little bit about a man everyone's probably at least heard of, if not studied extensively. William Shakespeare! Yay! So, as I mentioned, probably everybody's heard of this dude, so we are not going to be discussing him in grand detail, all the little bits and pieces. You can find plenty of information. I am just going to go over some basics so that we have an idea of what we're looking at on a whole as we start going into some of his specific works. Because it's nice to have an idea of everything and then how that narrows down into something specific. It's at least one framework that we can look at Shakespeare's work through. So, to begin, no one actually knows when Shakespeare was born. We do know, though, when he was baptized, which was April 23rd, 1564. So he was likely born in that same year. It's just a question of how long after his birth was he actually baptized, and people like keeping the date April 23rd because it turns out he also died on April 23rd in 1616. So people like that date, whether or not he would have been born and baptized on the same day, but those are the dates we got. Now, he spent his life, for the most part, of course, in England, and he was born and died in Stratford-upon-Avon, though the Globe Theatre was outside of London, so there's some crossover movement a little bit, but I'm saying he's not a globetrotter. Well, he, probably trotted around in the Globe Theatre, but he didn't, travel around the world or anything. And this is one of those things that starts making people suspicious. The same is true when you realize that his father was a man of several different trades. Shoemaker is one of the big ones that pop up, but he also held some lower political positions, and his mother was an heiress of some land, but they weren't significantly really high up in anything, though it should be noted he did help fight for the family coat of arms to be returned. So, I mean, there is a little bit of height there, but people are just like, how can you make money in the theater without already having a lot of money? Shakespeare did. Now, he would have gone to grammar school with a focus on Latin mainly and classics, but he would not have gone to university. And that's that other weird thing that people start pointing at and saying, Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. He spelled his name several different ways. He didn't have a consistent means of writing. I'm not going to be the conspiracy theorist here. I fully believe that Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, of Shakespeare upon the Avon, the Bard upon the Avon, is William Shakespeare. If you want to go conspiracy theorist, I mean, you do you, boo. It's just not going to be in this video. Or in this series. For the most part, I am going to be working under the assumption that Shakespeare wrote his works. Allowing for, if there are collaborations and moments like that, because the theater is a very interesting thing in this time period. It's not as we would describe theater today. And that's another big reason why we can actually allow Shakespeare to be Shakespeare, because he was known for, at his theater troupe, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which he was involved in very importantly by 1594. So, a significant portion of his career is done with the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and they go on to build the Globe in 1599. So, the troupe knew him, and the troupe had him hired on as a playwright. And theater is this weird little thing at the time where everybody's trying to be on the top of their game and trying to make sure nobody else necessarily is. So, when you actually have a Shakespearean script, especially if it's something like Oxford Shakespeare, which is a really good script. A lot of academic sources use the Oxford Shakespeare editions. If you look at footnotes, you'll start noticing they might refer to different folios or quartos, which refer to the different ways you'd actually fold the pages in publishing manuscripts. And there's differences between these, and that's because generally you don't actually publish plays while you're working on them, because you're very protective of your intellectual property. So Shakespeare would have actually been rewriting and writing the script as the Lord Chamberlain's men were rehearsing it and preparing for the show. So he would have a copy, but most of the actors actually wouldn't. They're working off of his master copy and then practicing things. Because troupes were actually rather notorious for trying to steal content from other performances, especially if those performances were very popular. In fact, things even within Shakespeare, you start finding sources in other places. One of his most bloody tragedies is actually Titus Andronicus, which you can find sources in the Spanish tragedy. So, like, these people are living off of each other, so you can't simply say, oh, there's hints of Christopher Marlowe's work in Shakespeare, so he must have been Shakespeare. No. They were contemporaries. Shakespeare would have known Christopher Marlowe's work, maybe even saw some performances, and that developed into his own work. That's true of a lot of the classical stories and myths that he actually takes, and of course his histories. So to say Shakespeare isn't Shakespeare because there are hints of other plays, other playwrights within his work, that's just how theater worked at the time. And that's why, for the most part, we have these sort of weird moments where, like, academic sources have had to try and figure out the most coherent version of a play while recognizing there were different versions and different versions with extra scenes, because Shakespeare was a very organic playwright who continued developing these plays as they were being performed. And so that's where we get all the different scripts from. Most of them, though, for Shakespeare aren't published until after his death. Now, there are some that maybe the Lord Chamberlain's men needed money, so they were willing to sell some of his scripts. Others, people say, are probably stolen and then published against anybody's will. So, I mean, even if you accept William Shakespeare as William Shakespeare, your little, like, heart for conspiracy theories can just chew on all these other things, right? There's plenty to talk about with Shakespeare. And it's interesting, but again, not the focus of this video. For the most part, I'm just introducing you to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is a gentleman of medium means who finds out through originally his poetry and then his dramas that he can make his life in the theater, and he successfully does for his lifespan. And that's good. It's actually fantastic for us because we get all of these works. What's important for us then to think about is how these works develop. Because there is a significant difference from Shakespeare's early works to his later works. And seeing that change is something we have to keep in mind as we're reading through different Shakespearean texts. So there's going to be some issue with categorization simply because Shakespeare is developing. He's not static the entire time. He's developing different ideas and exploring them. Categorization, there's usually 3, 4-ish categories. The 3 main ones you probably know of are tragedies, comedies, and histories. If a lot of people die at the end, it's a tragedy, including the hero. If there's a wedding in the end, it's a comedy. And if it probably kind of happened, it's a history. But already you can see the difficulties with this categorization. I mentioned Titus Andronicus already, because a lot of people do not want to put that in the same category as something like Hamlet, which was a later tragedy and a very thought-provoking one. Titus Andronicus is fully blood, guts, and gore the entire way through. There's not a lot to think about with it. You're cutting off people's hands, their tongues, you're raping women, you're baking people into pies and then making their parents eat it. It's actually one of Shakespeare's bloodiest plays. So, do you put that in the same category as Hamlet's psychological battle with this issue of his uncle and his father, and how that tragedy between generations spirals so out of control that everybody ends up dying? Like, already there's differences there. Now, I might be selling Titus Andronicus a little short. There's certainly some bits that you can dig into, but there's a reason it's not one of Shakespeare's massively performed plays. A lot of his later ones are certainly more popular. The tragedies seem to be more popular than the comedies. The histories are certainly exaggerated. You have to keep in mind that all the histories that Shakespeare writes, for the most part, are British histories, but he writes them in a way that makes the current monarch, Elizabeth I originally, then James I, feel good about the history of their own family. Right? Richard III can be the enemy, that's fine, he's the bad guy in the history of Elizabeth and James. You have to speak to your audience. So if your audience want blood, guts, and gore, go ahead. But his later plays, particularly a block right towards the end of his life, end up making sort of this fourth category, and that we call the romances, ending with The Tempest, but including A Winter's Tale, Pericles, and Cymbeline, where we suddenly have deaths occurring, but also weddings occurring, and every now and then gods show up, and people are supposed to be dead, but they're not, and yeah. It's this really weird sort of feeling where they're breaking the categorical molds and at least presenting a fourth category. And a lot of academics have accepted the fourth category. But there are earlier plays as well that don't fit comfortably into any of these. All's Well That Ends Well, Measure for Measure, and Trollodytus and Cressida are basically like undefinable category-wise because their morals and their messages and the genre just don't work out well. Because it's not a comedy, really, if the wedding is because you've literally been tricked and almost raped, right? Like, there are some issues with trying to categorize all of these plays within these very narrow confines. And this is true for a lot of them as well. There is one that always escapes my head, but the B plot, the side plot, is far funnier than the main plot. The main plot wants me to just punch the main dude in the nose, because hero deserves better. I will figure out what play this is and put the name on the screen. But it's one of those frustrating ones. Most of us wouldn't necessarily define The Taming of the Shrew as a comedy now. We recognize that it's a deeply abusive play. So Shakespeare, as Shakespeare, is this organic writer who's developing throughout his writing career. So when we look back, we have these plethora of works across multiple genres that we're then trying to really put into boxes. But when it comes to Shakespeare, I really think we need to take a step back and start letting those strict definitions go. It's going to be a lot more helpful in the long run to recognize this is the academic categorization of this play, but being able to also set that aside, to define why it fits into this category, but then also say, okay, let's look at what else is in this play, and not to let our readings of each individual play be based purely on their categorization. To really dissect these plays and interrogate them, not just as Hamlet as a tragedy, but Hamlet again as a psychological issue, as a mental health issue, as a battle between generations. things that start pushing against those limits of just saying a lot of people die, so it's a tragedy. Same with a lot of our comedies, and same especially with the histories. The histories, again, because of that bias, are going to start giving us a little more than just the historical facts. So where is that coming from, and how does it actually affect the story? Yeah, so most of this video was not in fact on Shakespeare himself, but on us sort of letting go of this strict categorization, enjoying the plays for what they are, and being able to interrogate them on different levels than just, is it a tragedy, a comedy, or a history, or a romance. So, with that said, as always, when you're reading plays, keep in mind these are things meant to be performed. It's going to be a lot drier and a lot more clumsy on the page than it necessarily will be on the stage. This is especially true with Shakespearean English because our modern English has actually developed past this point. We don't have the accents that make Shakespearean speech the easiest thing to perform anymore. So my suggestion honestly is, if you get a chance when reading any Shakespearean play to see a performance of it, preferably a theatrical performance rather than a movie performance, but I recognize you might have limited access to these things. Go online, check it out. Try and get your head around the idea that this is performance. There's going to be actions happening, sounds happening that's going to bring the dry written word to life. And if you don't understand a word, feel free to Google it. Half the time, Shakespeare actually invented words. Pandemonium. Who would have known? So, if you have some difficulty, slow down and start honestly checking through, looking up words, and getting into the meat and potatoes of these things. But, as always, it's easier. Start with the broad picture. See a performance, see it as it's meant to be on stage, and then start getting into what is actually being said. Because you're going to find there's a lot more bodily humor in a lot of these plays than none of us were really probably expecting. Shakespearean is supposed to be sophisticated, but sometimes it's definitely not. So, I'm going to get reading, and I hope you do too. Let's get to know some Shakespeare.